It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. Me, Ethan, and Mia. Just three best friends on the road, leaving the stress of work and school behind us. We'd planned this trip for weeks. A cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just us, a bonfire, and some cold beers. What could go wrong, right? We hit the road early, laughing, blasting music, and talking about all the random stuff we were going to do once we got there. The drive was smooth, and the sun was out. Everything felt, right? I leaned back in my seat, looking out the window as the trees blurred by, thinking how good it was to finally get away from it all. And then Mia's voice cut through the music. "Hey guys, you know what today is, right?" She sounded half serious, half amused, her eyes fixed on her phone. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, smirking. "What? Is it National Pizza Day or something?" "No, idiot," she laughed. "It's Friday the 13th. For a second, the car went quiet. Not because we were scared, but because it was so typical of Mia to bring up something like that. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, great. Just what we need. Some bad luck to spice up the trip. What's next? A masked guy chasing us through the woods?" I laughed, trying to brush it off, but something about the way she said it gave me a weird feeling. I mean, I didn't believe in that stuff, but still, Friday the 13th had a certain weight to it, didn't it? Ethan kept cracking jokes about how we were going to end up like some horror movie characters, running for our lives, and we all laughed along. It was ridiculous. We were just three friends going to a cabin in the woods, not starring in some slasher film. But looking back now, maybe we should have taken it more seriously. Maybe we shouldn't have laughed it off so easily. Because by the end of that weekend, none of us were laughing. Ethan was always the one to take the road less traveled. You know the type. Always seeking adventure. Always thinking he knew the best way to do things. So, when he spotted a narrow dirt road just off the highway, he didn't hesitate for a second. "Hey guys," he said, glancing over at me with that smirk he always had when he thought he was being clever. "This road'll cut at least an hour off the trip. Trust me." Mia raised an eyebrow from the back seat, already looking skeptical. "Are you sure? It's not even on the map." Ethan waved her off like it was no big deal. "Of course it's not on the map, Mia. That's the point. It's a shortcut. GPS probably doesn't even know about it yet. We'll be at the cabin in no time." I didn't think much of it. Ethan had pulled stuff like this before. A dirt road through the woods seemed harmless enough. And besides, an extra hour of daylight at the cabin sounded good to me. So, I shrugged and nodded. "Let's do it. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words. As soon as we turned onto the road, everything changed. The asphalt gave way to rough gravel, and the trees seemed to grow taller, thicker, almost swallowing us up. The canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, casting strange shadows across the road. The sound of the car tires crunching on gravel was the only thing we could hear, and even that seemed muffled, like the woods were absorbing the sound. Mia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting between the trees. "I don't like this, guys. It's creepy." Ethan snorted. "It's just trees, Mia. Relax. We'll be there soon." But soon, the GPS lost signal, and with it my sense of direction. The road just kept twisting and turning, and the deeper we went, the more overgrown it got. What started as a promising shortcut now felt like a trap, the road narrowing with every mile. The trees pressed in on us, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like skeletal fingers trying to pull us in. "I'm serious, Ethan," Mia said, her voice rising a little. "This doesn't feel right. We should turn around." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his usual confidence shaken just a bit. "We're fine. I'm sure it loops back around to the main road. We'll be there before you know it." But as we kept driving, I noticed something unsettling. We hadn't passed a single car, house, or even a sign of civilization for miles. Just endless trees and the ever-growing feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches seemed amplified in the silence. I wanted to say something, to tell Ethan to turn back, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. After all, what was the worst that could happen? But deep down, I knew we had made a mistake. After what felt like an eternity, we finally pulled up to the cabin. I'd be lying if I said the sight didn't send a chill down my spine. The place looked nothing like the cozy, rustic getaway we'd seen in the photos. Instead, it stood there like something out of a nightmare. Old, weathered, and completely forgotten by time. The wooden structure was rotting in places, with vines creeping up the walls as if nature itself had been trying to reclaim it. The windows were caked with dust and grime, giving it an abandoned, lifeless look. The porch creaked under the weight of our footsteps as we stepped out of the car, and the wind howled through the nearby trees, making the whole place feel even more isolated. Mia was the first to speak, her voice low and filled with unease. This isn't what I expected. Yeah, no kidding, Ethan muttered, scratching his head. But we're here now. Let's just make the best of it. I wanted to agree with him, but something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't just the rundown condition of the cabin or the eerie silence that surrounded us. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put into words. The air was thick, almost oppressive, like the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We grabbed our bags from the car and made our way to the front door. The key had been left under a loose brick, just like the owner said, but even unlocking the door felt like a bad idea. The hinges groaned in protest as Ethan pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Dust particles danced in the weak light from the setting sun, and the smell of damp wood and decay hit us like a wall. Inside, it was even worse. The furniture was covered in sheets, like the cabin hadn't been used in years. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the whole place had this unsettling stillness to it, like time had just stopped. No power, no running water, no cell signal. We were completely cut off from the outside world. Great, Mia said, looking around with a frown. No electricity, no phone signal. We're basically in the Stone Age. Relax, we've got flashlights and candles, Ethan said, trying to sound reassuring, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. Besides, it's only for a couple of days. We'll make it work. We dropped our bags in the living room, trying to settle in, but the atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracked windows made my heart race. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, like the cabin was watching us. The more time we spent inside, the more the unease grew. Mia stood by the window, peering out into the darkening woods. I don't like this place, she whispered. It feels wrong. I wanted to tell her she was just being paranoid, that it was all in her head, but I couldn't shake the feeling myself. The silence was too thick, the darkness too deep. I tried to convince myself it was just the age of the place, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But it wasn't just that. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. As night fell and we huddled in the cabin with nothing but candlelight to ward off the creeping shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The air felt charged, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching us from the corners of the room. I told myself we were being ridiculous. It was just an old abandoned cabin. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretched across the cabin, swallowing up the last bit of daylight. The temperature dropped quickly, and the only source of light came from the fire we had built in the old stone fireplace. The flickering flames danced on the walls, casting long, twisted shadows that made the already eerie cabin feel even more unsettling. We tried to shake off the weird vibes, acting like everything was fine. Ethan, always the optimistic one, suggested we make dinner to lift the mood. So, we threw together some sandwiches, opened a few beers, and sat around the fire trying to enjoy ourselves. But the unease from earlier in the day still lingered, thick and heavy, like a fog that wouldn't lift. Mia sat closest to the window, her eyes darting outside every few minutes. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan rolled his eyes, taking a swig of his beer. "Hear what, Mia? It's just the wind. We're in the middle of the woods. Of course there are going to be noises." But she didn't look convinced. "No, it's not the wind. It sounds like footsteps, like someone's walking around out there." I froze for a moment, straining my ears to listen. At first, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then there was faint, almost imperceptible asterisk crunch asterisk, like someone stepping on dead leaves just outside the cabin. Ethan waved it off, It's probably just animals. You know, deer or raccoons. We're in the woods, Mia. Relax. But Mia wasn't having it. She stood up, her eyes wide and searching. That didn't sound like an animal, Ethan. It sounded like footsteps, like someone's out there. I exchanged a glance with Ethan. He was trying to stay calm, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. I wanted to brush it off too, to tell Mia she was just being paranoid. But something about the sound, it didn't feel right. My heart started to race, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as if warning me of something unseen. We all sat in silence for a moment, the tension hanging in the air. The fire crackled, casting more strange shadows on the walls, and the soft crunch of footsteps seemed to get closer, then fade away, as if someone, or something, was circling the cabin. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. Maybe it's just, I don't know, maybe it's the wind pushing branches around. Or maybe Ethan's right. Could be animals. Mia crossed her arms, clearly not convinced, but she didn't push the issue any further. She just sat back down, eyes glued to the window, watching the darkness as if expecting something, or someone, to appear out of the trees. We tried to keep the conversation going, but the mood was dead. The fire, which had seemed comforting just minutes before, now felt like it wasn't enough to hold back the darkness pressing in from all sides. The cabin was too quiet, too isolated, and even though Ethan kept trying to crack jokes, the laughter felt forced and hollow. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. Ethan brushed it off like nothing was wrong, but I could tell even he was a little on edge. Mia, still tense, checked the locks on the door twice before heading to bed. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the cabin walls. The sound of the footsteps echoed in my mind, growing louder the more I thought about it. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but that creeping feeling, that awareness that something wasn't right, wouldn't go away. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dim, orange glow. My eyes started to grow heavy, but just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, asterisk crunch, crunch, asterisk louder this time. Closer. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over at Mia and Ethan, both of them fast asleep. I wanted to wake them, to tell them that something was out there, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me, my pulse racing as the footsteps continued. Whoever or whatever it was, they were still out there, just beyond the walls of the cabin, pacing, waiting. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the overwhelming feeling that we were not alone began to suffocate me. The next morning, I woke up to a cold draft sneaking through the cabin. The fire had long since died out, and the dim light of the early morning sun crept through the dirty windows. Everything felt eerily quiet, like the world outside had hit pause. Ethan was already up, poking around in the kitchen area, while Mia sat on the edge of the couch, staring out the window like she hadn't slept all night. Her eyes were puffy, and she kept chewing on her thumbnail, a nervous habit she had whenever she was anxious. "Morning," I muttered, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "You guys sleep okay?" Mia shot me a look that said no way. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked quietly. I paused for a second, thinking back to the footsteps, the sound that had kept me up most of the night. "Yeah, I heard something, but it was probably just animals, like Ethan said." Mia didn't respond. She just kept staring out the window, her unease still clinging to the air around her. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed completely oblivious. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's head out early and maybe hit up that lake we saw on the map before the drive back. Should be a good day." He grabbed his jacket and reached for the keys on the counter. Only they weren't there. Guys? Ethan turned, a puzzled look on his face. "Where the hell are the car keys?" I frowned and sat up. "They're not on the counter?" "Nope," Ethan replied, now searching through his jacket pockets. "I swear I left them right here last night." Mia finally tore her gaze away from the window, her face pale. "Are you sure you didn't leave them in the car or something?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I'm positive. I put them on the counter when we came in. You guys saw me, right?" I nodded, remembering seeing him toss the keys onto the counter as we settled in. But now they were gone. The three of us started searching the cabin, under the couch cushions, behind the chairs, on every shelf and surface we could find. We even checked our bags and pockets, just in case someone had absent-mindedly grabbed them. But after nearly an hour of tearing the place apart, the keys were nowhere to be found. "This doesn't make any sense," Ethan said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They were right here. Where could they have gone?" Mia's face had gone from pale to full-on panic. "Someone took them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone must have come in while we were sleeping and took them." Ethan shook his head, clearly not wanting to entertain that possibility. "No way. The door was locked all night. We even double-checked it, remember?" Mia stood up, pacing the room now. "But what if someone has a key? What if they came in while we were asleep? What if—" She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "What if they're still out there, waiting for us?" The room went quiet, and I could feel my stomach twist. The idea of someone creeping into the cabin while we were asleep made my skin crawl. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to swing open at any moment. But it stayed shut, locked, just like it had been all night. Still, Mia's fear was infectious, and I could feel my own anxiety starting to bubble up. The keys didn't just vanish. Either someone took them, or what? The thought trailed off, leaving a heavy weight in my chest. "All right, let's not freak out," Ethan said, trying to keep a level head, though I could see the tension in his jaw. "Maybe we just misplaced them. We'll search again, take it slow, and we'll find them. They have to be here somewhere." But as the minutes ticked by and the search turned up nothing, the creeping sense of dread only grew stronger. The keys were gone. Someone or something had taken them, and we were trapped in the middle of nowhere, without a way to leave. Mia stood by the window again, staring out into the woods with wide, fearful eyes. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. But without the keys, there was nowhere to go. Without the keys, we were stuck, trapped in this old, decaying cabin with no cell service, no way to contact anyone, and no idea how we'd lost the keys in the first place. The unease from the night before had only deepened, and by now, it was impossible to ignore. Ethan was pacing the room, his usual confidence shaken. "We can't just sit here all day doing nothing," he said, trying to sound upbeat but failing miserably. "Let's go for a hike, clear our heads. Maybe we'll find some signal out in the open, or even spot a nearby road." Mia shot him a skeptical look. "A hike? In these woods? You've got to be kidding." "I'm serious," Ethan replied. "Sitting here isn't going to help. Plus, we could use some fresh air. Get our minds off the whole key thing." His voice trailed off, as if he didn't even believe his own words. I wasn't thrilled with the idea either, but Ethan had a point. Staying cooped up in that cabin was only making things worse, feeding into our paranoia. Maybe a walk would do us some good, and if we were lucky, we might catch a bar or two of signal somewhere. "Fine," I said, grabbing my jacket. "Let's just not wander too far." Mia reluctantly agreed, and soon we were stepping out into the crisp, chilly air. The woods around the cabin were dense, the trees towering above us, their branches interlocking like a canopy, blocking out most of the sky. It felt like we were walking into a tunnel, the trees growing closer with each step. At first, we tried to keep it light, talking about random things, making plans for what we'd do once we got home. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The cheerful chatter faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Even the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, seemed to disappear. The path beneath our feet became rougher, the ground uneven and covered with fallen branches. I could feel the tension growing in my chest as the trees seemed to close in around us, their trunks like tall, silent sentinels. There was no breeze, no movement, just an oppressive stillness that made every crunch of our footsteps sound too loud. "Anyone else getting a weird vibe?" Mia asked, glancing nervously around. "It feels, I don't know, like the woods are watching us." I wanted to say she was just being paranoid, that it was all in her head, but I couldn't shake the feeling either. Something about the woods felt alive, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. "We're fine," Ethan said, though his voice had lost some of its usual cockiness. "It's just the isolation getting to us. Keep walking. We'll find some signal soon." But the further we went, the heavier the air became, thick with a sense of foreboding. Every step felt harder, like the ground was pulling us back, trying to keep us from moving forward. The trees loomed over us, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then we heard it, a low, distant whisper carried on the wind. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. We all froze, glancing at each other. "Did you guys hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan brushed it off immediately. "It's just the wind." But Mia wasn't convinced. She was staring off into the distance, her eyes wide with fear. No, it's not. I swear, I saw something. Over there." She pointed toward the trees, her hand trembling. Something moved. A shadow. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I hadn't seen anything, at least not yet, but the feeling in the air was enough to make my skin crawl. I stared into the thick trees where Mia had pointed, and just for a second, I saw it too. A dark figure, slipping between the trees, moving too quickly to be an animal. My heart raced, but before I could say anything, Ethan laughed. "Come on, guys, seriously? A shadow? This isn't a horror movie." But I knew what I had seen. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. There was something out there. "We need to go back," I said, my voice firm. Mia nodded, not needing any more convincing. "Yeah, let's get out of here." Ethan rolled his eyes, but even he wasn't laughing anymore. He led the way as we quickly retraced our steps, the air around us growing colder and the trees seeming to close in tighter with every passing minute. As we hurried back toward the cabin, the whispering grew louder, though it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. The woods had taken on a life of their own, the shadows twisting and shifting, always just out of sight but never far away. By the time we reached the cabin, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. We slammed the door behind us, locking it tight. For a few moments, we stood there in silence, trying to catch our breath. "What the hell was that?" Mia asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I admitted, glancing back toward the window, half expecting to see something or someone standing outside. But the woods were still, quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. We all did. And whatever was out there, it wasn't done with us yet. Back at the cabin, the tension was unbearable. It was like the walls were closing in on us, squeezing the air out of the room. We had barely spoken a word since coming back from the hike, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside made me jump, and I wasn't the only one. Mia sat on the couch, staring into space, her knees pulled up to her chest, while Ethan paced the room, restless, his usual calm completely gone. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. The cabin wasn't safe. It felt like the woods had followed us inside, creeping in through the cracks, watching us, waiting. The feeling of being watched, the heavy weight that had been lingering since we arrived, was now impossible to ignore. It pressed down on us, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. "Are we just going to sit here all night?" Mia finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave. We can't stay here. Not after what we saw." "Leave?" Ethan scoffed, though he didn't sound nearly as confident as he wanted to. "And go where? We don't even have the keys, remember? Unless you're planning to hike back to civilization, we're stuck here." The thought of going back into the woods made my skin crawl. No way was I stepping out there again, not after what we'd seen. But staying in the cabin didn't feel much better. It was like we were trapped, with something just outside the door, waiting for the right moment to make its move. Night fell quickly, the darkness outside pressing against the windows, as if it wanted to swallow the cabin whole. We lit a few candles, the weak flames flickering in the oppressive air, but it did little to chase away the unease. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, strange shadows across the room. And that's when it started. At first, it was just a soft sound, almost too faint to hear, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. Mia noticed it first, her eyes wide as she looked toward the door. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, barely moving. I nodded, my heart already racing. It was subtle, like the scrape of branches in the wind. But the wind had died down hours ago. There was nothing out there but us, in it. Then the sound grew louder, Astra's footsteps slow, deliberate. They were too heavy to be an animal. Someone or something was circling the cabin just outside, as if it was looking for a way in. Ethan grabbed the flashlight, his knuckles white around the handle. It's just an animal, probably a deer or something. His voice trembled, though he tried to sound brave. But Mia wasn't having it. That's not an animal, she whispered, her voice shaking. It's the same thing we heard last night. I stood frozen in place, my eyes locked on the window. The footsteps were getting closer now, circling around to the front of the cabin, slow and steady, like they were testing us. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Suddenly, a shadow flickered outside the window, barely visible in the candlelight. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see through the darkness. It was there, just beyond the glass, a dark figure standing motionless, watching us. I wanted to scream, to warn the others, but I couldn't. My body refused to move, like I was paralyzed by fear. All I could do was stare, my heart pounding in my chest, as the figure outside slowly shifted. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a shape that didn't quite make sense. Its outlines seemed to blend into the shadows, shifting and flickering like smoke. It had no face, just darkness where a face should be. But somehow, I knew it was staring right at me. Ethan noticed my silence and followed my gaze to the window. His face paled as he caught sight of the figure. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, backing away slowly. Mia looked too, her eyes filling with terror. "Oh my God," she gasped, barely audible. "It's real." The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching us through the glass, unmoving. The air in the cabin was thick, almost unbreathable, as if the very presence of this thing was suffocating us. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing could explain it. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow moved. In one fluid motion, it slipped back into the darkness of the trees, disappearing like it had never been there at all. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. We were still frozen in place, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. The footsteps had stopped, the night outside deadly quiet. But the presence lingered, heavy and oppressive, like the shadow was still out there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I finally found my voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "We need to leave." But deep down, I knew there was no escape. Not from this. Whatever it wasn't going to let us leave so easily. As if things couldn't get any worse, the storm hit. It came out of nowhere. 1 minute, the woods were eerily silent, and the next, the wind was howling, shaking the trees like they were trying to tear free from the earth. The rain started in heavy, cold sheets, hammering against the windows so hard I thought the glass might shatter. The power, which had been flickering on and off, finally went out for good, plunging us into complete darkness. The only light came from the occasional flashes of lightning that lit up the room for split seconds at a time, throwing everything into stark, jagged shadows. The candlelight flickered, struggling against the storm's force, and we huddled in the middle of the room, too scared to move. Ethan sat next to me, gripping the flashlight, though the batteries were already starting to fade. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a silent, creeping panic that matched what I was feeling. Every time the lightning flashed, I could see the tension in his face, his jaw clenched tight, his hands trembling just slightly. He was trying to stay calm, trying to be the leader, but I could tell he was losing it. Mia, on the other hand, had given up pretending. She was sitting with her back against the wall, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't sobbing, just shaking, whispering to herself over and over, "We're not getting out of here. We're not getting out." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her we were going to be okay, but I didn't believe it myself. The storm was only making everything worse, amplifying the dread that had been hanging over us since the shadow first appeared. It felt like the cabin was being sealed in, like we were trapped inside a pressure cooker with no way to escape. And that thing, that shadow, it wasn't gone. Every time the lightning lit up the room, I would glance toward the windows, expecting to see nothing. But there it was, just outside, moving closer. The storm didn't seem to bother it at all. If anything, it was using it to its advantage, creeping up on us under the cover of the chaos outside. Each flash of light revealed the same dark figure, its outline barely visible through the rain and wind, but unmistakably there. It circled the cabin, like a predator playing with its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stared out the window, my heart hammering in my chest, as the figure drew closer with every flash of lightning. It wasn't just my imagination. I saw it, tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and blurring in the storm, but always moving toward us. I wanted to scream, to warn Ethan and Mia, but my voice was caught in my throat, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was witnessing. Ethan finally broke the silence. "We need to figure out what the hell is going on." His voice was shaking now, his calm facade completely gone. "This can't be real. It's just some guy messing with us, right?" But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Deep down, he knew, just like I did, that this wasn't something we could explain away. This wasn't just some guy. Mia let out a choked sob, hugging her knees tighter to her chest. "We're going to die here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's going to get in, and we're going to die." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we'd find a way out, but the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. The air inside the cabin was thick with fear, the sound of the storm outside, making it feel like we were completely cut off from the rest of the world. The windows rattled with each gust of wind, and the shadows inside the cabin seemed to grow darker, deeper, as if the storm was feeding whatever was out there. Ethan stood up, pacing near the window, his flashlight flickering in his hand. "We need to fight back," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to get in." But how could we fight something we didn't understand? Something that wasn't human? Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and I saw it again, closer this time. The shadow was right outside the window, its form more distinct than before. It was tall, looming over the cabin, its head nearly scraping the branches above. Its body was still shifting, blurry at the edges, but I could make out more details now. Long, thin limbs like stretched out arms, and a featureless face that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was staring directly at us. For a moment, everything went still. The storm outside seemed to fade, the howling wind silenced by the weight of that thing's presence. I could feel it watching us, feel its hunger. It wasn't going to leave. It was just waiting for the right moment to make its move. The next lightning strike lit up the cabin, and in that brief second, I saw it pressed against the window, its face almost touching the glass, staring at me with those empty, black eyes. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my body frozen with fear. It was so close now, too close. "We need to leave," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "But where could we go?" And then it hit me. The keys. They hadn't just been misplaced, they were taken. In the chaos of the storm, the shadow, the fear, I hadn't put it together until that moment. Whatever was out there, whatever had been circling the cabin, it wasn't just some random force of nature. It was playing with us, watching, waiting. The realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. My heart raced as I stood up, my body moving on instinct. "The keys," I muttered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. "What?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky, barely holding it together. "The keys," I repeated, louder this time. They didn't just disappear. It had took them. Ethan's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Mia, still trembling by the window, looked up, fear in her eyes. "You think it took the keys?" I didn't respond. I couldn't waste time explaining. My gut told me that whatever this thing was, it had been toying with us all along. Maybe it wanted us trapped, or maybe it had a different plan altogether, but I knew one thing for sure. We had to get out of there. I bolted across the room to the spot where we'd last seen the keys, the little wooden table by the door. I dropped to my knees, frantically searching the floor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely focus, but then I saw them. The keys were lying there, half hidden under the edge of the rug, like they had been there the whole time, untouched. How could they have just reappeared like that? My mind raced, trying to process it all, but there was no time for questions. I snatched them up and turned to Ethan and Mia. "Let's go." Now! Ethan didn't need any more convincing. He grabbed Mia by the arm, and we rushed out the door into the storm, not bothering to lock it behind us. The rain was coming down in heavy sheets, the wind howling like some wild beast, but none of that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting out. We stumbled to the car, the mud squelching beneath our feet, the wind whipping at our faces. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I tried to unlock the doors, but after what felt like an eternity, I managed to get them open. We piled in, slamming the doors shut, the sound of the rain hammering against the roof like gunfire. For a moment, the car was silent, except for our ragged breathing. I jammed the key into the ignition, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. For a split second, the engine hesitated, sputtering as if it might not start. My stomach dropped. What if it didn't work? What if we were stuck here? But then the engine roared to life. Without a word, I slammed the car into drive, my foot pressing hard on the gas. The tires spun in the mud for a moment before finally catching traction, and we sped off down the narrow, winding road. The trees blurred past us, the headlights barely cutting through the torrential rain, but I didn't care. I wasn't slowing down. I wasn't stopping. We had to get out now. The cabin disappeared into the darkness behind us, swallowed by the storm. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. I could hear Ethan and Mia whispering to each other in the back seat, but I couldn't make out the words. All I could focus on was the road ahead and the growing distance between us and whatever had been watching us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the main road. The rain had let up a bit, but the storm still raged behind us, as if trying to pull us back in. But we were out. We had made it. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding, my body trembling with a mix of relief and exhaustion. I slowed the car down just a little, my heart still racing. That's when I glanced into the rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. There, in the back seat, just behind Mia and Ethan, was the shadow. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I saw it. Those same shifting, smoky edges, that same featureless face. And this time, it was smiling. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, but I was frozen, my eyes locked on the mirror. The shadow didn't move, didn't lunge or attack. It just sat there smiling at me like it had been there the whole time, waiting for this moment. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the road, but deep down, I knew it didn't matter. We hadn't escaped. It was with us, and it wasn't going to leave. We didn't talk about what we saw. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the storm far behind us. When we finally reached the nearest town, we parted ways without saying a word. I haven't spoken to Ethan or Mia since, and I never will, because I know the truth. That shadow, it's still out there. It's always been out there, and it's waiting.